So my name is Tom Woods. I am a senior associate in the Juvenile Justice Strategy Group at the Annie E. Casey Foundation. Welcome to our discussion about capacity challenges, meeting capacity challenges, both in facilities and more importantly, in our communities. Our goal is that by the end of this hour, you will be equipped with some ideas to inform your thinking and some examples to enrich your work about strategic capacity planning. So now let me tee up our discussion. Many of our youth justice colleagues around the country, and perhaps many of you, are under intense pressure right now to respond to a surge in the number of incarcerated young people by sinking more resources into secure confinement. Now, those pressures are real. People's concerns about community safety are valid, and certainly worries about how to safely manage a growing incarcerated youth population are very warranted, totally warranted. At the same time, experience has shown us over and over again that rushing to expand incarceration capacity can be a grave mistake for two big reasons. First, secure confinement is in general the costliest, the riskiest, and the least effective thing that youth justice systems do. And second, once that capacity is built, you keep paying for it for a long time. So committing resources to expand that capacity today means a lot fewer resources will be available, both today and tomorrow, to spend on other interventions that are likely to be more effective. So system leaders, community advocates, all of us really need to think about capacity planning strategically, looking at all the capacities we need at every level of the system, and recognizing that in challenging times like these, maybe the resource we need the most isn't more detention beds or even more staff, maybe it's more imagination. So in this challenging landscape, really nobody knows how to navigate it better than our speaker today, Vinny Schiraldi, who is widely and deservedly regarded as one of the preeminent people in our field. He is currently the Secretary of Juvenile Services in Maryland. But over the past 30 years, he's led one major youth justice organization, the Center on Juvenile and Criminal Justice, and helped to establish several others, including the Justice Policy Institute and the Columbia Justice Lab. His government service prior to his current role includes leading the Department of Youth Rehabilitation Services in the District of Columbia, the Department of Probation, and the Department of Corrections in New York City, as well as serving the New York City Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice. And he has a unique vantage point of having worked in this field when youth crime was rising and when it was falling. He's held some of the toughest jobs in government and worked with advocates to challenge and change government agencies from the outside. And in that wide-ranging career, there is a constant through line that at every agency he's led, Vinny has taken on big, complex reforms, and in every instance, he's been strategic about capacity planning. That really means he's focused on three things. First, using data to drive decisions about system capacity. Second, using those capacity planning decisions to widen the array of services and solutions that systems avail themselves of, and to push system resources into those areas. And third, using those resources not just to fund new programs, but to build new relationships, to really open the system's doors, building new partnerships and changing the way that government and community work together. So it's his experience with and commitment to that approach, more than just his amazing resume and his sparkling personality, that make Vinny a perfect person to talk with for this part of today's event. So welcome, Vinny Schiraldi. How are you doing, Vinny?
I'm sparkling.
Sparkling. That is definitely the way to start a conversation like this. So so let's just jump into it. There's I mean, we all know there's so much public concern right now, even alarm in a lot of places about youth violence. Have you ever seen anything like it?
Yeah. No, I mean it's a little toe in the water of what we experienced during the super predator era. It hasn't, been as long, because it was a long, like mid 80s to the end of the 90s, sort of pounding on juveniles with, media and politicians sort of almost competing for who could say the more vitriolic stuff about kids. So this hasn't sort of deteriorated to that level yet, in my view, but it's starting to smell like it did at the sort of late 80s, where even our friends were starting to sort of slide to the right. I think it was in the mid 90s when not just John DiIulio, who was never our friend, but Hillary Clinton, who kind of was for a while and was certainly on the board of the Children's Defense Fund, and she certainly should have known better, started to use the word super predator to describe kids. And that was really a nadir in this field. But that's also when a lot of people started to step up, and Casey Foundation being a good example. In some respects, you couldn't imagine a worse time to start to fund the juvenile detention alternatives than it should have been 1994. That's the year that Newt Gingrich took over the House, and that I think 26 or 27 states passed 3 strikes and you're out law. And that was the decade in which almost every state increased the ability to lock kids up with adults and diminished confidentiality protection. So it was a real terrible time for young people, terrible time for advocates, and an existential threat to the juvenile court. I think the mid-90s Coalition for Juvenile Justice report to Congress was called, it was 1999, because it was the 100th anniversary of the juvenile court. Celebration or Wake was the name of the report that year. So it's been bad before. We survived that, but we didn't survive it. I hate the phrase pendulum, because pendulums swing back and forth due to gravity. That's not the way social change occurs. Social change occurs because people jump on and pull the pendulum, and that's what we need to do.
Yeah, and that's sort of, you know, that's kind of an example, that context, that longer range view. You know, that's sort of a reminder of something that we always need to hold on to. There's so much that we've learned over the past couple of decades that it's very easy to forget in the heat of the moment. You know, we talked about kind of leading with data to kind of you know, sort of inform and frame questions for public debate. What are some, you know, some data points that sort of jump out to you that you think are most helpful?
So, you know, in anticipation of this, I pulled some data that Tom, you had sent me, but also Mike Males had sent me. So I'm gonna see if I can use my adept technical skills. There we go. Can you all see that?
Yes.
So the first one shows, you know, how much lower the rise in homicides is in for juveniles than it is for adults. So we can see, you know, just how different that was. It's actually not the one I wanted to share. Wanted to share a different one, but here it is. And then this next one, I think is Maryland data, but my understanding is it's the same as national data. And this was sent to me by Mike Males. Shows how both homicides by juveniles and homicides by adults are rising slightly more for adults. The first one I've liked to show, and I guess I messed it up when I created the slides, shows that even though there has been an uptick in juvenile homicides, it is dwarfed by the uptick that occurred during the 90s. So sorry for the confusion, but you know, two important data points is this is nowhere near as bad as it has been in the past. In Maryland, the shootings by kids is barely worse than it was pre-pandemic. Then it went down a lot, then it came back up a lot. So it's, you know, maybe a year or two prior to the pandemic, it was worse than it is now. And then it's not all the kids. It's very similar to what's happening to adults. The pandemic was a very difficult time, and you know, the rise has been occurring over a while, at least in Maryland. Now, that doesn't mean that if somebody sticks a camera in your face or if you're talking to some politician that you don't acknowledge the concerns about too much gun violence in America. You have to do that. You can't just be a nerd and throw some data at them. I'm carrying around a binder with 24 cases now of kids on my caseload on my department's caseload who have shot someone or been shot since I started in February. So that's like coming up on 5 months. And I only have 1,800 kids in the community on probation and aftercare. You know, 1,800 kids is like the size of a high school. 24 kids had been shot over a 5-month period. There would be a declaration of a state of emergency. And if it was a white middle class high school, a lot of care and concern about how they were doing, how to deal with their trauma, how to steer them in the right direction, how to make sure this didn't permanently affect their lives would be what we were talking about. That's what we need to talk about with the kids on all of our case loads.
Right. Yeah, that, I mean, 24 is a big number when you think of it as 24 individual kids, 24, you know, sort of families of those individual kids, their neighbors, the impact that it has on communities is real. But the context around that is so important, and just kind of trying to find a way to get people to kind of an emotional state where we can really sort of grapple with the problem rather than kind of fret or panic or lash out about it.
Yep. Yeah, that's right. I think that's absolutely right. And some of that is taking lumps. I mean, there's no way to get around that. Right after something terrible happens, there's a real instinct to sort of want to get tough, to want to, do something dramatic that makes you feel like you're solving the problem. And, like it or not, our job in this field is to be the skunk at that party, if that party is doing stuff that really evidence doesn't support. And I just don't, there's just no way around that. I think that we have to sort of put on our big boy and girl pants and recognize that this is not going to be an easy ride. And we need to speak the truth to power that will help move this in the right direction.
Right. Yeah, and there are so many things that we've have learned how to do, that we are learning how to do. There are kind of it's sort of nobody should be complacent when they see numbers like that, but at the same time nobody should feel hopeless or overwhelmed in looking at those and looking at those statistics either.
That's right. Now, I started looking at other data obviously when I started, apropos to the point of this discussion around whether using data to make sure that this is not a moment where we start to reinstitutionalize kids. And as my department, the population of my department in our facilities was declining. It was about 77% decline in the decade prior to my getting here for placement, and about over half decline in detention. So it was coming down a lot, which is true in lots of other places. The department did shed some of its budget and some of its staff, but we never shed ourselves as quickly as the population declines when it's declining that quickly. And I think if you look around the country, you're seeing that the costs per kid are going through the roof, the back office, the caseloads. And so I started looking at the data around, how's that playing itself out in my department. One thing I noticed is that between me and a frontline staff in one of my facilities, there are 8 supervisors, 8 levels of supervision. And between me and a case manager, which is a probation officer or aftercare worker, there are 5 levels of supervision. So we have supervisors, 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 supervisors. We have 2,100 staff and 2,100 kids. And remember, 1,800 out of those 2,100 are in the community. So that's about $150,000 per kid per year that we're spending. When you look just at the facilities, which are increasingly declining in population, the cost per kid ranges from a low of $420,000 per kid per year to a high of $1.2 million. And if you walked into these places, you would not say, "Wow, this is great. This looks like a $1.2 million, program to me." They're not as terrible as some of the stuff I've run. I mean, I've run Rikers Island, I ran Oak Hill. Nothing in Maryland is as bad as that. But in many respects, we now have a kind of different opportunity if we can figure out a way to pivot the politics of it. We have this opportunity where just extraordinary amounts of money are being spent on, an approach that's just solidly mediocre at best. And maybe, our vacancy rates that, are plaguing all of us in this field are really an opportunity, because it's a lot harder to lay people off than it is to just freeze vacant positions, capture the money and move it into the community. Even that's not easy, but it's a lot easier to do it when those positions are vacant than when they're full. But I'm not trying to trivialize the political, point here, which is that people are freaking out about juvenile crime and are leaning more towards locking more kids up. But if we can make that pivot, the resources available to most departments around the country are pretty substantial.
Yeah. Yeah. So the resources are there. And I think that your kind of idea of kind of thinking about and being able to gauge kind of how far removed you are from the actual interaction with the kid, and thinking about each one of those layers of supervision as being its own opportunity.
Yep.
To change frontline practice, to change the way that, to change the mental models that people bring to this. You were just sort of giving us an example before, really, of kind of how to use some data in order to kind of reframe the conversation about sort of youth crime and violence in general. Turning more to the specific question about kind of system capacity, what's your experience been, or what are some of the kind of the strategies that you like to take to kind of reframing questions about capacity, so that rather than focusing on things like how many secure custody beds do we need, focus on like what resources and opportunities the kids need, the young people need, in order to stay out of trouble, to keep on track, to in order to thrive and survive. So how have you approached that in the past? And and you've got such a you've had to deal with this in so many different roles. How have you approached that in the past, and are you thinking about that differently right now for how you would approach it in Maryland?
Yeah, yes, and yes. When we were in New York, we had a unique opportunity because Gladys Carrion was head of the Office of Children and Family Services, which was the combined child welfare juvenile justice agency at the state level. And me and John Mattingly, and later Ron Richter, were the head of the system in New York City. And a kid had died in custody upstate. The Justice Department sued. The cost per kid, which was shared by all the counties in the state, and the state 50-50, was going through the roof. And a recidivism study had been released by the state that showed really high levels of recidivism. So there was just an enormous amount of pressure on the juvenile justice system in general. Jeremy Travis chaired a committee that really found some terrible outcomes and terrible conditions for the kids. And so, we took that moment as an opportunity, instead of just trying to trim the number of kids in custody, to really reimagine what it could look like, and got Mayor Bloomberg to propose to brand new Mayor Cuomo to just give all of the family court kids back to New York City, and a portion of the money that the state was spending. So that was called the Close to Home Initiative, and Gladys and me and our counterparts at the state and our colleagues started to negotiate the important details. The city set up a committee to study it. Casey, John Jay, Vera helped provide technical assistance. Really cool data-driven work, very nerd-like stuff. Tom, you helped us create this what I thought you and Jeff Butts helped us create this really neat forecasting model that, as we punched assumptions in real time, would tell us if we reduce technical violations by 25%, what impact that would have on beds. And then we, as policy experts, put our assumptions in and use that to forecast beds. So when at the beginning of, around the year 2006, New York had 1,500 kids in state custody. By the time we were negotiating close to home, we were down to 500 or so kids. Close to home passed in 2014, I believe, by which point we forecast needing 300 beds. I think we padded it a little because we're a little afraid that we were under forecasting. We captured the money and used it to stand up a whole bunch of alternatives. I don't think we ever had 200 kids in those close to home facilities. Now, New York City, the biggest city in the country, 8+ million people, has about 60 kids from its family courts in those facilities. Most of them are home with services and not in any facility. And the facilities are 6 beds, 8 beds, 10 beds. They're in houses scattered throughout the 5 boroughs instead of large institutions in upstate New York where kids' families never got to see them. That checks a lot of my boxes. The box I think we failed to check though is I don't, we when we did it, we were rushing and sometimes the window's only open for so long, so you got to rush through it. But we didn't really, in my view, work with community in the way I hope to do in Maryland, with grassroots folks, with the kind of folks that are already doing a lot of good work with young people in their own neighborhoods. We kind of issued RFPs and larger vendors bid on. Certainly that's better than being sent far away to a large locked facility. But I think that as we go forward, it's in my view better to work and see if we can empower communities at a very local level. That's what I'm hoping to do in Maryland, and I'm hoping to do it together with the Department of Human Services, with child welfare kids, and the correction system with young adults, so that our 3 agencies can start to capture savings from downsizing, put that money into the 10 or 15 neighborhoods that most of the young people who are being taken out of those neighborhoods come from, and kind of reverse what the essence of mass incarceration was. Mass incarceration wasn't just an era where we pulled a lot of Black and brown young men out of their home communities and spent billions on prisons. It was also a time when we divested in those communities. And so if we're going to go the other way now, if we're going to really take a run at mass incarceration for adults and kids, money's got to flow into those communities in a way that empowers people and respects them and honors them, and can't just be about issuing an RFP that some big vendor gets, as good as those big vendors can sometimes be.
Yeah, and if I could just to sort of reflect back on that a little bit, the close to home experience in New York City, I think sort of for the benefit of everybody else, that's a great example of I think of kind of sort of forcing some different data, a different set of facts into the conversation, because I think where that conversation started, kind of naturally enough, said, well, we've got this many kids upstate, so we need to make space for that many kids down here in New York City. And kind of you were among the people who helped to kind of sort of break open that conversation to say, well, actually, why would we expect that we're going to keep sending as many kids into that sort of end of the system as we used to? So it forced people to look a little bit upstream and say, well, I mean, we've got a very low percentage of kids who are eligible to have their cases adjusted or eligible to be diverted. We're not diverting most of those cases. Couldn't we do a little better on that end of the system? Looking a little downstream from that, saying actually for this group of kids, we've got sort of an unnecessarily high rate of probation violations. So these kids who are trying to keep out of placement, they end up coming back into placement because we're not doing the right kind of work with them in the community. And that's sort of bringing new data points to it, broaden the conversation and broaden the range of levers that you had in order to kind of get where you wanted to go. I think what you're talking about in Maryland is like that plus a whole other level of complexity, but also a whole other level of opportunity, because you're bringing new people into the conversation. People who live in the communities, have been doing the work in the communities, who know the kids, who know the families, and who really have just been kind of waiting, kind of starving for the resources and the support that they could be getting from the system in order to really do their best work. So do you have any thoughts at this point about specifically kind of how to engage those folks and kind of, sort of bring them into the conversation alongside the system folks so that everybody's on an equal footing and they can really kind of weigh in an effective way?
Yeah, and I just wanted to show folks what a close to home facility looks like. So that's the locked facility for boys in Brooklyn. I think the capacity is 10 kids. Uh, it's a bit of a non sequitur to your question, Tom, but as I was talking about it, it made me realize that we did have a picture I could show you. This is from a paper called "Can We Eliminate the Youth Prison" on the Square One Justice website. So I'll stop sharing because it's annoying to do that. And then I think the Justice Lab did a nice job of this down in Harris County with probation chief Henry Gonzalez and Lena Hidalgo and the Arnold Foundation, Laura Arnold particularly, of really engaging communities in a way that empowered them and stopped the building of a large facility, downsized facilities, and co-designed what was going to happen in that community with the people from those communities, from the heavily impacted communities. Colorado, I thought, did an excellent job with the Latino Coalition for Civic Engagement. After the killing, after the murder of Tom Clements, the secretary or director of their Department of Corrections, I forget what his exact title was, but he was the head of the Department of Corrections, was killed by a guy on parole who was pretending to be a pizza delivery guy. And there was a lot of, understandable, agitation around that. Legislature initially started with, more mandatory sentences and tightening, conditions of parole. But the advocates really jumped into the fray and said, this is not what Tom Clemens would have wanted. He was a very progressive corrections commissioner. And they actually got the state to start to capture some of the savings from downsizing their facilities and using what they call an intermediary or a backbone organization, the Latino Coalition, who then kind of translated community to government and government to communities, served as the go-between. They would get the funds, they would parcel them out to community groups that were at a very grassroots level in an amount that they could handle so that they didn't get blown away. They'd build capacity for those community groups, do their back office work so that they could report the data and report, bill for the amount of money they were supposed to get, and then build capacity so that they could ultimately do that themselves without needing the Latino Coalition. And they've now, I think they get $80 million a year, is all being parceled out to 19 communities around the state of Colorado. So we're actually looking to do something like that in Maryland. Again, like I said, rather than just do it by ourselves, DJS with our 1,800 kids in a 6 million person state, that's kind of this much in 15 communities. It wouldn't be that much of an impact. But the corrections department has 40,000 people on probation and parole, and the Department of Human Services has tens of thousands of kids in their aegis, if you will. So if we can combine all three of us, we really get to work with communities on what they need to thrive and feel safe, and then resource those in a way that sort of works for those communities for an intermediary. And I think we can really start to not just impact the individuals that are on our caseloads, but to start to have a cumulative effect on the community where we start to bolster informed supports. I think that as we've sort of landed on these communities in the era of mass incarceration, we've dramatically disempowered them, and we've subtracted, in my view, from community cohesion, kinds of stuff that neighborhoods used to deal with themselves through clubs and mentors and church groups and coaches and fill in the blank, started to be done by correctional systems, which is just it's a worst possible development. And we can't undo that and keep all our toys. we as government bureaucrats have to recognize we got to give some of this stuff up. We're lousy at it. We're good at some stuff, but we're not good at providing services to kids of color who are struggling with a whole bunch of challenges in their own communities. And we need to admit that, because that's the first step towards recovery. And then we need to start to share our toys with the people who can really do a better job of keeping their own community safe than we can.
Yeah. And I think that the Latino Coalition that has sort of evolved in Colorado is such an interesting example of that. You went out to visit there as part of your, kind of preparing for the role at DJS. What are some of the things that you saw out there that really kind of caught your imagination, or that you're the most interested in trying to replicate?
Yeah, so Casey flew me and my incoming chief of staff, Mark Schindler, out. Nate came with us, and Steve Bishop and Dana Kaplan from the National Institute for Criminal Justice Reform. And we're hoping to sort of, together help that approach evolve in Maryland in the way I just described. A couple of things that were impressive to me, like, we asked the Latino Coalition, like, how do you find these people? How do you find who the true grassroots people are? And they said things like, we went to the homeless encampment and hung around there until it was chow time, and we followed everybody to see where they were going for food. And they were going to this woman's house who was feeding them out of her own kitchen with money she was raising from donations from people around the neighborhood. And we said, can we help you? And then we met this other guy that was helping people out of the back of his car. We met this other guy we met these people. They introduced us to him, who said, I came out of prison myself, and I've done time. I bought several houses in a neighborhood that a lot of people coming out of prison live in for cheap. And I was renting them to those guys because they couldn't find any place to live. They had no, credit record, and their criminal record was making them. So I was just renting it to them, but, payments weren't coming in on time. And I was literally about to crash and burn and have them all foreclosed on. And the Latino Coalition came and said, we can help you do your books. We can provide you with some funds. And that's what they did. And now this was years ago now. So many of these places have evolved to the point where they're much more sophisticated and are able to, make applications for federal grants and whatnot. But they all credit this process as something that took them from a nascent grassroots group to one that can really provide their communities with a lot of supports in ways that would be difficult to imagine government doing.
Yeah, so in thinking about some of the, kind of in addition to money, when you kind of look outside of just the realm of budget, what are some of the things that you think government agencies or kind of the formal system can do to support true grassroots organizations like that, not just in terms of providing them with funding, but sort of non-financial support, air cover, sort of assistance with kind of gathering data about their own programs, equipping them with data from other sources that might help them to inform what they're doing. What are some of the things on your kind of sort of checklists?
Yeah, a couple things. One is sharing power, and there's lots of different ways to do that. In Oakland, NICJR, Nick Jr., I like to call him, has a diversion program where even on pretty serious felony arrests, the police bring the young person who's been arrested to a panel of neighborhood elders who negotiate a diversionary approach. That's a real power shift instead of taking them straight to jail or straight to court. And I see a million people chatting a million things. I think this is called NOAB, NOAB. But if somebody else on this can look it up and put a link in the text, that's pretty cool. I went, in the New York City, there was a spike in shootings in public housing. And Liz Glazer, who's the head of the Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice and my former boss, got together with the residents in those public housing developments and the 12, I think, government agencies, from Parks and Rec to mental health to probation to the police, Department of Youth and Community Development, and said, okay, we got the city's resources here. What can we do to help make this neighborhood safer? And they came to consensus around a bunch of stuff: midnight basketball, putting lights up where there are dark spaces, putting up chess tables where drug dealers used to be, you know, it's a whole bunch of cool stuff. And but then they monitored it publicly together to show, you know, which departments have committed to which things and are they getting those things done. I went to New Zealand a few years ago, where this tribe way north in New Zealand, whenever their kids would be detained, they would send them either 4 hours away to Auckland, 7 hours away to the bottom of the North Island, or literally sometimes to the South Island, and put them on a boat if those two facilities were crowded. And the tribe said, this is not cool. We don't want to send our kids that far away. Judge, when you need the kid detained, we got him. We'll take care of him. And so they then put them, you know, different members of the tribe would take the young person in, and then other members of the tribe would mentor them and, you know, sort of move them along the process, so that during the day, the family that took them in could go out about their regular daytime activities. They called it invisible remand. So, and the reason I'm saying that is because this can be small or big. It does, you know, like, we have so few kids in some of our systems, we shouldn't overcomplicate our lives. There are people in these communities that have ideas. They don't just all come from think tanks and, you know, headquarters of our departments. In fact, I would argue quite the opposite.
I love that term, invisible remand.
Yeah, isn't that cool?
That's such a cool idea, because it is there's sort of you know, in sort of a setup like that, where the relationship between that kid and their family and their peers and the, you know, sort of the folks in their neighborhood, that set of relationships is the thing that sort of provides the accountability.
Yeah.
So there's no, like, you don't need to put a kid on probation in order to, like, sort of keep track of them and have some sense that they're being held accountable. They're being held accountable. They just don't need the court to be the intermediary for that.
Yeah. I mean, you know, Impact Justice has come up with this homecoming project. I love that concept, where they found that there were a lot of older folks in I think it was East Oakland, that had, you know, they had raised their families and their families had moved away and they had extra bedrooms. And so they paired them with guys coming out of San Quentin who needed a place to stay. And during that 90, 120 days, they would move into these people's houses. They would meet each other first. They'd move into these people's houses, and then they'd get social services and supports, and, you know, gradually be able to get their own apartment. In New York, the Osborne Association is doing something similar. They call it kinship reentry, where instead of paying a halfway house, which are not very good many times, they pay a family member who, but for $500 a month, would take care of their brother or cousin or nephew coming back from prison. But the lack of that little bit of money means they can't rent an apartment with an extra bedroom. And so then you put them into a several $1,000s a month halfway house, or nothing. So they're in a cardboard box or a homeless shelter. So, you know, people are thinking up ideas. It almost doesn't matter what the roster of ideas you come at the table with. It kind of matters what works in Cumberland or Salisbury or East Baltimore or Prince George's County, which are, you know, neighborhoods in Maryland where things are wildly different, urban, suburban, exurban, and rural.
Right. Which is, you know, it's a challenge for you as the head of a state agency.
Yeah.
That, like, kind of the level at which things are meaningful is the local level, which is, you know, again, it's kind of like how many layers away am I from the, you know, from the frontline worker? How many layers away are you from the from the relevant community level, and how do you kind of shortcut to that, to get to that right level?
Yep. And Clinton's speaking on another panel, but I've learned a lot from him and David Muhammad about working closely with formerly incarcerated people. One of the bad artifacts that we got lemons, so maybe we make lemonade, of mass incarceration is that every part of Maryland there are formerly incarcerated people who have struggled with the issues that many of these young men and young women are going to be struggling with or are struggling with. And they have lessons they can teach in all of those towns I just mentioned. So if you could figure out a way to sort of train them and get them, resources and have them do the kind of reporting that they need to do so that they can, get government funds in a responsible way, man, you got to arm your people that know something that a lot of us white middle-class social workers from, NYU, which describes me, don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's a kind of, sort of there's sort of a separate set of challenges once you get to that right level of community presence and community involvement. In order to get to that level, there's a bunch of things that need to happen at the system level in order to kind of free up the resources to, kind of pivot people's mindset, and get agencies, statewide agencies, juvenile courts, kind of formal system agencies, to think of themselves as support for a local, for a local ecosystem rather than the people who are driving the bus. And I know that this is, something that came up in some of the questions that people provided in advance through registering for this event. Several of the questions involved, kind of relationships with different different formal agencies other than the Juvenile Justice Agency or the Juvenile Court. Obviously you got to get those other systems on board, or at least willing to play, with the strategic direction that you're taking in order to get there. I know one of the major child serving systems that's kind of on that other side of the fence is the schools, and so many schools right now are reeling from kind of hangover from the pandemic, which has been just an incredibly difficult time for them. In many cases, they are grappling with sort of a level of violence, actually not just affecting their kids, but in some cases in or right next to school property. They're sort of closer to it, or at least feel closer to it than they have before in many cases. What's your experience been with that, or what are you kind of running into right now in Maryland and trying to kind of broker good relationships and kind of find a way to be a good partner and build a good relationship with the schools?
Yeah, I mean, this is definitely a challenge, Tom, that you've identified, or the questioner identified. A lot of folks in communities are scared, and sometimes schools can really be a vortex for that kind of fear, with the notion of kicking kids out so that the good kids can learn, and that's something I know that many of us in the juvenile system chafe at. Again, I don't have any magical answer, by the way. You can check email or go to the bathroom right now, because it's not like I'm coming up with something that's going to be, oh wow, Vinny said this, we should do that. It's working the problem and using facts and figures, just like working the problem for detention reform is the best I got. But I do think, as I said earlier, we need to acknowledge those fears, as even if they're not data-based, even if schools are the safest places for kids to be, which they are, we need to acknowledge those fears so we don't come across as unfeeling, either bureaucrats or kind of snotty data people.
Right. So it's just kind of another example of the, kind of a micro example of the broader problem.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Use your information and your resources, not just to, to kind of support and provide resources to other people to do their jobs better, but to try and help them get to a, kind of a, sort of a mental model and emotional state, kind of an evidence base that they can work from in order to do their best work. Part of it is, just kind of giving people permission, to be in something other than kind of reaction kind of reaction mode.
This is also one of those areas where the cops can actually sometimes help, because, most cops know what real crime in the community is like, and know that sometimes the teachers are overreacting and wanting to use police forces and departments of juvenile services as a catch-all for their fears and frustrations. Not always, but sometimes the cops are actually pretty good allies on this, because it's like, come on, we'd never arrest this kid a half hour after he got out of school for this, so why are we arresting him for? Like, this should take him to the principal's office, not to DJS or to detention.
Yeah, and I guess that's sort of a natural. Some of the other questions that are starting to come in through the chat. Some of them are about kind of the specific complexities, the specific challenges, both of working with individual cases of kids who've committed more serious violent acts, or just working with any kid in the wake of a serious, one or more kind of serious violent incidents. It really is. It's amazing how much a kind of one bad incident can echo, sort of in a neighborhood, in a community, in an agency, and kind of how long how long that can stick around as an influence on decision making. And obviously that's an issue in Baltimore in particular, but really in Maryland generally.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think it's an issue in lots of other places: Philadelphia, Cleveland, Chicago, New York. I think that for much of the last decade and a half, maybe, the juvenile justice field has been evolving in the direction of, let's get a really good risk and needs assessment of, train the hell out of our staff so they know how to use it correctly. And then once we have that, apply the kinds of services, supports, and opportunities, but mostly services that are going to address those needs and risks, right? That's kind of the RNR mantra right there. And, my understanding, and I'm, Tom, you probably know better than me about these risk assessments, is that most of them really are assessing more or less generic risk. I remember Dave Muhammad told me that when he was running the probation department in Alameda County, he literally had 2 cases come before him. One was like a 50-plus-year-old guy that was, had a heroin habit, and one that was a much younger guy who had shot somebody, and that they were both of the same risk. And he literally called the model provider for the instrument and said, am I doing this right? Are these guys the same risk? And they said, yeah. I mean, one of them's probably a medium level risk for stealing a can of beer from the store, and the other one's a medium level risk for getting shot or shooting somebody. But yeah, they're both medium level risks. And I think that the juvenile justice field, the sort of our part of that world, has been satisfied with that. And the spike in shootings, I think, should have us sort of take a look at the violence interrupter world, where they've done a lot more with who is this kid associated with, and in his world or her world, who has been shot or has been involved in gun violence, because that's likely to create this sort of back and forth in ways that greatly increases their risk of coming to harm or harming somebody. And I think we need to pair those, and that's what we're going to try to do with the National Institute for Criminal Justice Reform, which has helped West Baltimore have a 33% decline in shootings over the last year through trying to figure out who those folks are that might come to harm, and then wrapping services around them and providing financial incentives to engage with those services. And they offered those services to 91 people. 81 of them took them over the last year. And so if we could mesh that in a way that is non-fascist, that doesn't sort of trail them, nail them, and jail them, which is definitely the trick when you start to predict, right? Then I think we can both perhaps drive down violence and harm amongst the most at-risk group of our young people, as well as help them thrive.
Yeah. Yeah, I know, and in all the jurisdictions that we work with at the Casey Foundation, I mean, I haven't come across a risk assessment instrument that's better at predicting violent, sort of violent offending than just general getting in trouble. The risk factors that we know how to gauge and that these tools are kind of out there to collect information on, they're pretty useful for predicting, kind of general likelihood that somebody's going to get in trouble again. But it's, pretty poor at predicting which individual people are going to end up, sort of doing or being victims of serious violence. My hunch is that in a lot of cases, it comes down to location. That somebody with the same, and in a kid who has a very similar background, very similar set of risk and protective factors as another kid in another neighborhood, the difference between one of them getting involved in a shooting and the other one not very often is just where they live.
Yeah.
So that really just kind of, it drives you back to that, sort of the point that you made before, that so much of it is really neighborhood specific, highly localized, and kind of the more that you try to, sort of navigate things or control things at a, kind of a statewide or even a countywide level, the harder it is to really kind of come up with the right tailored solutions that are going to help the kids who need the most help. It's that sort of missing link, is that truly localized, sort of planning and service delivery capacity that something like the Latino Coalition provides sort of a roadmap for.
Yeah, I mean, I saw some questions. It's hard to keep up with the chats, and I'm trying not to focus on it because then you kind of get like just moved around. But I saw some people asking about, does this include violence? I would say absolutely yes. Just to, sort of to expand on what you just said about places. Jim Austin, Bruce Western, and I did a paper when I was at the Justice Lab on violence, and a couple of the conclusions were if people don't specialize in violence, the violent rearrest rates for property offenders, drug offenders, people who have gone to prison for property offenses, gone to prison for drug offenses, and gone to prison for violent offenses, the violent reoffending rate is about the same. The violent offenders are no more likely to reoffend in a violent way as the drug offenders and property offenders are. And that it's, as you said, easier to find violent places than violent people. And, it's funny because a lot of people in the system kind of backhandedly acknowledge this, right? Where we say, this kid was doing great in our facility. We put all this time and energy into him, and then we sent him home and he crashed and burned. And in some respects, I think that's a kind of way of making us feel like, aren't we good? And aren't their parents and their communities bad, right? As opposed to saying, maybe the things we're doing don't make sense. They don't solve the problem we're ultimately trying to solve. They just pull a kid away and punish them for a period of time and then return them no better off. So maybe we need to think of different ways of doing this. I'm not saying that means nobody ever gets pulled away. Sometimes actually, I think that's not a bad thing, and they just shouldn't be in brutal environments. But more importantly, we need to reinvest in the neighborhoods they came from, and we need to have partnerships. I think for a lot of us, when we go into these communities as the system, they hate us, right? Because we're the government, and we've been screwing that neighborhood over forever and ever. It shouldn't surprise us that they're not thrilled to see us.
Yeah, and this, I mean, I think this, sort of the path that this conversation has taken is really the, kind of in order to kind of land at a spot like this, where, we've kind of really been able to kind of explain and highlight the importance of place alongside all of the other factors that we're trying to control for and manage for. And when we talk about place, we're really talking about people. We're really talking about organizations and, sort of people who are based in those places. They're the ones who need to be heard. They're the ones who need the resources. They're the ones who need to be, kind of the real front line for what we do. This is kind of the arc that you really ideally want capacity planning conversation to follow. And in order to get to that point. You really need to kind of start at the beginning, kind of start at the beginning the way that we did here with, kind of big society-wide problems, start to unpack what we do, what we know, what we don't know, what we know doesn't work, and just kind of get, kind of chip away at it until you get to that, you're able to land on that consensus, that we're not just talking about community first out of, sort of a sense that that's the right way to go about it, but because we've kind of convinced ourselves, we've learned that that actually is the right place to begin and end the conversation. And I guess just because I feel like I've taken it too easy on you and haven't given you any challenging questions to respond to. One that came up in some of the questions or comments that people registered before this event through the registration form. A couple people brought up how both racist and anti-racist narratives can affect the way that we think about capacities and resources, and sort of undergird a lot of those things, those sort of assumptions. So how do you think about that in your mind? Is there such a thing as an anti-racist approach to capacity planning? And if so, what do you think that would look like?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of what we've already been talking about, by taking the resources and the power back to the communities that the kids come from, as opposed to, housing them in the sort of centralized bureaucracy. I think that is an anti-racist approach, but I also do think we have to name it as racism as we're doing. We have to actually remember that this mass incarceration that we're in, at its very beginnings, started as a racist approach by the Nixon administration and the Southern strategy to peel off Southern white Democrats and Northern suburban Democrats from a reliably, sort of a Democratic base into the Republican Party by making them afraid of Black people and hippies, which is exactly what Ehrlichman wrote in his diary. He literally wrote that in his diary. And that sort of started that way. It started well before that, but before the early 70s, crime was not a salient political issue. Since the 70s, it became a salient political issue. It's overtly racist, and the prison population from the declaration of the war on drugs by Nixon in 1972 rose every single year till 2009, when it started to come down. And it only started to come down after decades of declining crime that helped drive it down largely. So it started that way. I saw some data from Nate about my home state of Maryland, in which Black youth in Baltimore County are 20 times as likely to be arrested and 35 times as likely to be prosecuted than white youth in Prince George's County, our two biggest suburbs, Baltimore County and Prince George's County. We have to name that, and then we have to create solutions that empower the communities where the kids live, where everybody looks like them, not where everybody looks like me and you.
And I know we are kind of working down to the closing minutes here. And I think that kind of tees up another question that I wanted to ask that has come up in the chat. We've talked about community voice and finding ways to both to kind of break down interagency barriers, break down barriers between agency and community, and kind of bring community into capacity planning conversations. There's another dimension beyond that, which is youth engagement. So youth participation and youth voice specifically, like not with the community speaking for the kids or the agency speaking for the kids, but young people speaking for themselves. Are there any kind of particular examples or sort of principles, or kind of what are you thinking about that as you undertake the work that you're taking on in Maryland?
Yeah, I think that there's been a lot of really good work. I'm trying to remember there's this group in Virginia, and I'm blanking on their names right now. Performing statistics that sort of brings youth voice out of juvenile detention facilities. They spoke at one of the youth correctional leaders, YCLJ meetings, and they put up the young people's artwork. It was just beyond fantastic. And a lot more of that is coming from grassroots organizers and nonprofit groups that are where the young people are trying to have a voice in school, criminal justice, juvenile justice issues in ways that are very, very important. I think that our role is to make room for that and bring that right in, even though it's uncomfortable. And it is uncomfortable because the first things that's going to be discussed is how we've been failing. And what we think well of ourselves, right? Most of the people who do this think we're the good guys. And so it's hard to have people come into your space, right? Your space meaning your department that you run. And the first thing out of their mouths is you're failing at doing the essential thing you're supposed to do. Again, we just have to get over that, right? And we have to recognize that these are not terribly successful systems, and that it's important to hear from a whole bunch of voices, including and especially the young people who are directly affected by it, and their families and their communities.
Yeah, and I think, and just even the way that you just put that, I think it's it's so valuable for the folks within the system who, I think you're right, kind of need to be willing to, sort of basically go kind of disarmed into conversations like that, because they really they need to hear. And, there's folks who need to be heard, who have very, very legitimate and longstanding beefs, with the way that the system has treated them, the way the system has treated their communities. At the same time, I think internally, it's important to kind of broach that to staff, broach that to the people who want to do the right thing, who think that they're doing the right thing. It's like that deserves some empathy too.
Yep. So